they highlight the walking out of your taking upon yourself the yoke of the kingdom of heaven. And so what you see is sort of a hierarchy of yokes that has been established by the traditions of the fathers. And in here you can see Shaul's argument about, if you want to use the terms justification and sanctification, you believe through faith, and that faith results in the outworking of that faith through commandments, through obedience. The rabbis believe the very same thing. Okay? First, you would have to take upon yourself the yoke of the kingdom of heaven, which is the acknowledgement that God reigns supreme and that He dominates my life through His holiness and through His righteousness, and I have become one of His children. And only then, when you have placed that yoke of sovereignty upon yourself, then you can place the yoke of the Torah, or the yoke of the commandments, upon yourself. For all the transgressions of the Torah, whether he repented or not, the Day of Atonement brings atonement, except in the case of one who throws off the yoke, perverts the teachings of the Torah, and rejects the covenant in the flesh. And again, that's from the Talmud, the traditions of the fathers. Shavuot 13a. You can see the terminology here, very interesting to me, throwing off the yoke. When you do so, you pervert the teachings. You do away with your part in the covenant. For the sages, the metaphor yoke was one of willing submission to the Torah and ultimately to the rule of God. Now you can see this in this midrash on the prayers. And they say, and the top is part of the bottom here, why would the declaration of the Shema in Deuteronomy 6:4 be recited before, and it shall be if you hearken to my commandments? Again, first we are justified by faith, and then we are sanctified through the working out of that faith in obedience, in order that one should first receive upon himself the yoke of the kingdom of heaven, and then receive upon himself the yoke of the commandments. Very interesting how all this seems to flow very smoothly with Rabbi Shaul's teachings to the various congregations of non-Jews. The rabbis taught the very same thing. First, you must take upon yourself the yoke of His sovereignty, and only then are you allowed to and can operate properly in the context of His commandments, in the walking out, the halakha. So, really, when you strip the layers back, you see that things really aren't that different. Some things are. We have talked about those things. Notice how Yeshua uses the idiomatic, metaphorical language of the day when I'm hearkening back to that Matthew 11. By using this terminology and directing it to His disciples, He affirmed His authority. They were taking upon themselves the yoke of Him. He was the master. Okay? What does He say later in the book of John? Remember? If you love me, you will obey my commandments. First, they had to take upon themselves the yoke of Mashiach, which is easy and light, which gives life more abundantly. And then, naturally, the outworking of that is you will obey my commandments. Can you see sort of the connections here? You begin to connect the dots, and it paints a very beautiful picture. Although Yeshua did not specify as to the type of yoke that His was, what was most important was that it was His yoke. Would He have serious issues with this terminology as applied to His usage of the term today? I don't believe so. Again, don't confuse Messiah's gentle approach and terminology as an excuse to do whatever you want, because that's what's happened. Okay? People have taken this, take upon yourself my yoke because it is easy and light, and we can just skip through the daisy fields and everything is wonderful and we're free to do whatever we want. That's not the case, because He says, if you love me, you will obey my commandments. Those who are shut out of the wedding feast later, what happens? Get away from me, you workers who are lawlessness. Even they do everything in His name. They prophesy in His name, they heal, they cast out demons in His name. They are not even allowed in because they didn't obey His commandments. They may have taken upon themselves the yoke, but they didn't work that yoke out in the form of obedience. Okay. Is it okay if we go a couple minutes over, guys? Here, I apologize. We've got to get through the end of this, and I have a bad habit today of being long-winded. So sometimes I just feel it needs to be said.
We also started a little bit late.
Yeah, we started a little bit late, and I really apologize. I didn't preface it by saying that we're not going to get into Romans 9 through 11 and Shaul's grafting in. It wasn't possible. I was taking the skin of things as it was. So, again, don't confuse Messiah's. I already said that. His yoke was certainly contained most of all of the above. The yoke of the commandments, the yoke of the Torah, the yoke of the kingdom of heaven. We were to place all of those within his framework, within his context upon ourselves. And they were to be viewed and practiced correctly through submission to him and eventually through the power of the Ruach HaKodesh, through the power of the Spirit. So when Shimon refers to the yoke upon the shoulders of the Jewish people as a burdensome thing, it was because it was with two Torahs as one. Okay? Because it had become the yoke, not of commandments, but it had become the yoke of the rabbi's interpretation of the commandments, which oftentimes usurped the written word. This is where you hear the term legalism. The two have become inseparable. And this is where the problem lies. And you can see it here. Rabbi Eliezer the Moabite said, "He who profanes the holy things and despises the festivals and shames his associate in public and makes void the covenant of Abraham our father and gives interpretations of Torah which are not according to halakha." Now this isn't just any halakha, this is the halakha of the rabbis. "Even though he possessed Torah and good deeds, he has no share in the world to come." Very powerful statement. Again, directed towards anyone who chooses to throw off the yoke of the rabbi's interpretation of the commandments. And this is where the problem lies. So much so that without their interpretations, one was unable, as the text says, to enter into the world to come. Now that is a burden that Yeshua came to deliver us from. Okay? His yoke, which is light, certainly has nothing to do with that. And the one confronted by the men of the Jerusalem council. So Shimon digresses. And Shaul and Barnabas share their miracles that God has done in their midst and in the surrounding nations. Yaakov, Yeshua's brother, then stands and breaks the silence, sharing the following text from the Tanakh as being fulfilled, or at least in the process of being fulfilled. "After this I will return and I will rebuild the fallen tent of David. I will rebuild its ruins and I will restore it, so that the rest of mankind will see the Lord, that is, all of the Goyim, all of the non-Jews who have been called by my name, says Adonai, who is doing these things." A beautiful text in the process of being fulfilled, God's plan of salvation for the peoples of the nations. These were Yeshua's own brother's words in the midst of the congregation there. Then he continues, "All this has been known for ages. Therefore, my opinion is that we should not put obstacles in the way of the Goyim who are turning to God. Instead, we should write them a letter telling them these four requirements." Part 1. Abstain from the things polluted by idols. The letter version, which appears in Acts 29, states these things offered to idols, or sacrificed to idols. F.F. Bruce says that the Greek word used for polluted, contaminated, refers to pollutions resulting from contact with idol worship. So it doesn't have to necessarily be transmitted through physical touch, but it's also tainted by association. Okay? This is how the sensitivity is gauged here, even by association. Undoubtedly, the pagan practices associated with foreign temples is being addressed here. We've talked about halal certified meats. I think, Raul brought that up not too long ago. Oh, it's wonderful. It tastes great. It's bled properly, but they also face Mecca when they slit the throat and bleed the animal, and they offer it to Allah. So it's tainted by association. You see the very same thing here. Okay? Another form of idolatry. Part 2. Abstain from the fornication. It's very interesting because the English translations don't have the word "the" as a preface for a lot of these. But it's very interesting to me when it talks about the things, because it seems to me it's highlighting something specific, something that was well known. If you just said a general statement, abstain from things in general, well, what are those? Abstain from the things, and you darn well know what they are. Because all of you are actively participating, duplicitously participating in all of these things. Stay away from the things polluted and from fornication. Abstain from what is the things strangled. One was not to eat what is strangled, meaning meat that has not been butchered properly, allowing the blood to flow out. In our class on clean and unclean foods, I want to get into that a little bit more, but unfortunately right now we don't have the time. Number 4, abstain from the blood. It's a pretty powerful statement there. The drinking of animals' blood would by nature also be addressed, since it was not only connected with requirement 3, but played a role in the temple practices of the time. Some suggest that this is kind of a metaphor for murder. I don't necessarily see that in the context. What I do see, even though these look very much like the Noahide laws, and some people believe that this is kind of a derivation of the 7 Noahide laws, what I really see is the purpose for them, and that's what is so amazing to me. 3 of them, 3 of the 4, have to do with food. Now that's not a coincidence at all. Again, what was Shimon accused of? Going to visit and to eat with them. Okay? All of these, whether through physical touch or through association, had become tainted. Not only did Yaakov want non-Jews to flee from their duplicitous pagan temple-oriented worship, but he also knew that if any acceptable, sustainable fellowship was to take place between Jews and non-Jews, it would begin at the table. These were precursors to table fellowship. Okay? Jews could not eat food that was tainted, whether physically or through association, by the idolatry of the day. That's how you would become ritually, ceremonially unclean. So these 3 would help, 3 of the 4 would help establish closer community between Jews and non-Jews, a starting point, if you will, for us to be able to fellowship. Everything we do is done over bread, is it not? The breaking of bread, the greatest discussions, let's get together and talk, well, what are we going to eat? It's all done around food. So it's natural, the 3 of the 4 have to do with food. But if you're going to have Jews in your presence, yes, they can come into your home, but you cannot have any of these things to feed them, or let alone in your home. Okay? These 4 requirements became the bare minimum in order for Jews to establish fellowship and some type of union for non-Jews. And how do we know this? Well, look at verse 21. The famous verse 21. For from the earliest times Moshe has had in every city those who proclaim him, with his words being read in the synagogues every Shabbat. Yeshua's own brother. Now, I don't know about you, but again, when I say starting point, I mean starting point, because who were the people that most benefited from what was happening here? Who were the people that had the most to lose if they had to become physically circumcised? It was the God-fearers. But what did the God-fearers have to do to be considered a God-fearer? They had to maintain synagogue discipleship. Yaakov knew, hey, let's just start at the table for right now. But does that mean that that's it? Not at all. Okay? Because we know that all of them, every Shabbat, are going to be going to synagogue. It happens every Shabbat, and the Torah of Moshe is reiterated cyclically all the time. So these God-fearers, by their association, their discipleship within the synagogue, are going to learn all the other things. But for right now, let's just start with this so we can at least eat with each other. We don't want to be shouting from house to house because that house over there is tainted or unclean. Let's at least be able to talk with each other. We can talk on Shabbat about the depth and the richness and the walking out of the commandments because we know that they're going to be there. They had to be there. So we see a beautiful beginning to the revelation of one of God's greatest mysteries. Both Jews and non-Jews are saved through faith in the Messiah. And all of us have fallen short of God's glory. The council declared that non-Jews did not have to become Jews in order to receive salvation and be a part of God's covenantal community. We see that. But a baby grows up, does it not? And do you feed a baby filet mignon steak? No. You feed a Gerber. It starts off with Gerber. And that's fully known and accepted within human society, that you feed a baby food. Okay?